Hey everyone, tonight we're going to look at one of the best survival flexes ever. How Native Americans made teepees that kept them warm and comfortable even when the temperature dropped by 3 degrees, which is when modern people start to panic. So before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming to see us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. And let's take it easy as we go on this journey tonight. When you picture a house that can handle winters at US 30 degrees, the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes question their life choices, you might think of something heavy, fortified, and very unwelcoming. There are thick stone walls, small windows, and a fireplace that is so big it could be a roommate. It's like a medieval castle, but without the castle. But the people who really did well in that setting, not living in stone blocks. They lived in tipis, which are beautiful aerodynamic structures that look simple from a distance, but are actually smarter than half of the buildings we build today. And I don't want to be rude, but tipis don't get enough credit. Europeans would have written operas about these things if they had come up with them. There would be paintings called Ode to the Perfect Cone and whole architectural programs based on the sacred geometry of portable warmth. But since this, a lot of history books just say, a kind of tent. That's like calling a NASA spacecraft a metal canoe with ambition. From the outside, a tipi looks clean and minimalist, the kind of design that would get posted on Pinterest under off-grid goals. But every inch of it exists because generations of people watched the land carefully and learned exactly how the wind, snow, and temperature behaved. Not guessed. Learned, meanwhile, Europeans on the plains were, building little square cabins that trapped smoke inside like they were trying to hotbox themselves into the afterlife. What blows my mind is how perfectly the teepee works with the environment. It doesn't try to fight the wind. It slices through it. It doesn't try to hold snow. It shrugs it off like a buffalo having a bad morning. Modern houses could never. They see one snowflake and immediately panic about roof damage. The teepee's response: cute, try harder. And honestly, I admire that. It's architectural confidence. Here's my personal opinion. The teepee might be one of the smartest human inventions ever created. Portable, insulated, ventilated, warm in winter, cool in summer, easy to repair, easy to move. Even IKEA furniture can't compete with that list. And IKEA furniture comes with an instruction manual that looks like a hostage note. The teepee wasn't just a shelter, it was a survival machine, perfectly adapted, perfectly efficient, and perfectly suited to a world trying daily to freeze you into a decorative ice sculpture. And that, my friends, is why people inside a teepee stayed alive while winter outside screamed like it was auditioning for a horror movie. Before a teepee could become the warm, elegant winter powerhouse it was, it needed a skeleton, and not the spooky Halloween kind. It needed poles, long ones, straight ones, strong ones. Fortunately, the Great Plains had exactly the right tree for the job, the lodgepole pine. a tree so perfectly designed for tippy construction that I think nature was showing off. Let's talk about these poles for a minute. They were tall, thin, light, and surprisingly strong. They were like the supermodels of the tree world. If you've ever tried to drag a big wooden beam across a field, you know that light and strong don't usually go together, but lodgepole pines do. Honestly, trees shouldn't be allowed to have that kind of good genetics. The process of choosing poles wasn't random. People didn't just walk into the woods, point dramatically, and yell that one. They understood exactly which trees worked and which ones didn't. And here comes my personal opinion. This is where indigenous engineering truly humbles modern people. Most of us can't pick a ripe avocado without causing emotional distress. Yet, these communities selected structural materials with mathematical confidence. Once cut and prepared, the poles were arranged into a tripod, the foundation of the teepee. This tripod wasn't wobbly. It wasn't a test. It wasn't, let's see if this holds. No, it was strong enough to survive winter winds that could knock the personality out of a buffalo. And let's be honest, if your house can stay up in a plains storm, you deserve a medal. After setting up the tripod, the other poles were put around it in a precise spiral pattern. This wasn't just for looks, though it does look great. The spiral helped spread the weight evenly, let snow slide off easily, and made a. This is the kind of engineering that modern stadiums brag about. But the teepee did it first, without steel, computers, or architectural firms charging outrageous consultation fees. Here's the part people never talk about. Lodgepole pine poles were used for years, even decades. They traveled with families from camp to camp, winter to summer, across hunting grounds and seasonal sites. Imagine a house with reusable walls that don't fall apart. 5 minutes after you put them together. Something IKEA users can only dream about. In short, the lodgepole pine wasn't just a tree. It was the backbone of the plains home, a perfect architectural gift from the environment. And honestly, modern buildings could learn a thing or two from those poles. The type's cone shape might look simple, almost too simple, but that's part of the design's evil genius. It's the kind of architectural brilliance that hides behind effortless elegance. You look at it and think, oh, nice, triangle, but then winter comes and the temperature drops to minus 30 degrees. The wind howls across the plains like it's late for an appointment, and suddenly that triangle is doing miracles. Let's start with the obvious. A cone is aerodynamic. A teepee doesn't fight the wind. It doesn't argue with the wind. It doesn't stubbornly insist on being a rectangle like European houses. No, it just leans back and says, do your worst, while the wind slides up and over it like it's been emotionally dismissed. I've always believed that if European colonists had arrived with less architectural ego and more willingness to observe, they would have stared at the teepee and said, oh, so that's how you avoid freezing to death. But no, they built boxes, cold boxes, smoky boxes, boxes that leaked heat like they were trying to cool the entire continent. Meanwhile, The teepee, with nothing more than poles and hides, behaved like it had a degree in. One of the best things about the cone shape is that it sheds snow. Snow doesn't pile up nicely on the roof, it slides right off. This keeps the tippy from collapsing under weight and creates a kind of built in maintenance system. You don't have to climb onto your roof with a shovel, scream into the void, and wonder why you chose to live somewhere cold. The teepee takes care of itself. The shape also affects how heat spreads. Warm air naturally rises, and inside a teepee it moves in a spiraling motion up through the center and down along the walls. This keeps the heat even, so there are no freezing corners or cold drafts stabbing you in the kidneys while you sleep. I can't say the same for most modern apartments. Let's not forget stability. A teepee can handle storms that would rip a colonial house apart like a toddler opening a gift. The cone-shaped channels stress downward through the poles into the ground. This is why teepees bend, flex, and survive instead of breaking. A building doesn't need to beat nature, it needs to work with it. This is something that people often forget. In my opinion, if the cone shape had been invented in Europe, architects would still be talking about it today. There would be statues, parades, and a national holiday to honor the holy cone of structural integrity. But indigenous nations perfected it quietly, efficiently, and beautifully because the goal wasn't praise. The goal was survival, and the cone delivered once the tippy's wooden skeleton stood proudly against the wind on the plain, looking like the world's most intimidating tripod. It was time to dress it, and not with just any material. No flimsy cloth, no sad colonial canvas, no "we hope this works" fabric. Teepees were wrapped in buffalo hides, one of nature's greatest winter inventions, and honestly better insulation than half of what modern outdoor stores sell for outrageous prices. Let me be clear, buffalo hides weren't chosen because they were convenient. They were chosen because they were perfect. A buffalo is basically a walking furnace wrapped in fur and muscle, surviving winters so cold even the snow considered relocating. If an animal can shrug at us 30 degrees like it's early autumn, its hide is absolutely the thing you want surrounding your home. Sewing the hides together was an art form. It wasn't grab a needle and hope for the best. It took skill, patience, and generations of perfected technique. The hides were softened, shaped, and stitched using sinew. Durable, flexible, and far. Better than most threads you can find today. I think modern sewing tools would cry if they saw what sinew could do. You could lasso a small car with that stuff. Once sewn, the covering became a single, huge sheet, a winter cloak big enough to shame any medieval king. Draping it over the tippy wasn't random or chaotic. It was done in a specific order, with the seams lined up so that wind blew over them instead of through them. These were the details that Europeans didn't get. They thought homes needed thick logs, bricks, and prayers. Meanwhile, native nations were creating an aerodynamic, insulated, weatherproof masterpiece with hides and knowledge. One of my favorite aspects is how the hide covering wasn't just functional, It was adaptable. In winter, extra hides could be added for more insulation. In summer, sections could be rolled up to allow airflow. Meanwhile, most European settlers spent winter alternately freezing and smoking themselves out of their cabins, wondering what mysterious force made living comfortable. Spoiler alert, it was bad design. And here's a personal opinion that no one asked for, but I'll say anyway. The buffalo hide covering might be the most elegant example of using the land without abusing it. The hides were a gift, not a resource to exploit endlessly, but something to respect, use wisely, and honor. The final result, a teepee wrapped so tightly and intelligently that even roaring winter winds had to take a moment and say, well, all right, fair enough. If you've ever seen a buffalo up close, you know two things right away. It's huge and it's dressed for winter. Buffalo hides weren't just warm, they were absurdly warm. They were unfairly warm. They were so warm that you have to wonder why modern winter jackets cost so much and do so little. I've worn jackets that were supposed to be windproof, thermal, or Arctic grade, and somehow a buffalo in January still looks more comfortable than I do walking to. The mailbox. This is why buffalo hides were used to make the winter armor of the teepee. A buffalo lived outside all its life, at temperatures that would make people panic, minus 30 degrees. That's Tuesday for a buffalo. The fur is thick, the hide is thick, and the insulation is so good that snow falling on a buffalo doesn't even melt. This means its body is holding heat very well. That's not biology, that's a flex. So, picture sewing together a bunch of hides into one big. It was like wrapping your whole house in a North American version of a luxury polar survival suit. But the buffalo didn't try to sell you on things like ultralight, breathable, or revolutionary fabric technology. The hide just said, I will keep you alive. You're welcome. Another thing I love is that the hides were not wasted. Nothing on a buffalo was thrown away. Meat, bones, sinew, fat, hooves, and everything else had a purpose. The hides were treated, softened, tanned, and prepared with knowledge accumulated over hundreds of generations. People today struggle to assemble a bookshelf from a Scandinavian furniture store. Meanwhile, these communities were turning massive animal hides into airtight, winter-ready home insulation. The hide's thickness made them excellent at blocking wind. And if you've never stood on the Great Plains during a winter storm, allow me to describe it. The wind does not blow, it attacks. It acts like it has unresolved emotional issues. It finds every gap, crack, and weakness. Buffalo hide handled that wind like a pro bouncer at a rowdy bar. No entry. Move along. The best part is that a buffalo hide tippy didn't just keep warmth in, it also kept moisture out. Snow slid off instead of sticking, and rain beaded and rolled away. This wasn't primitive technology, it was highly refined environmental engineering. In my opinion, if buffalo hide insulation were sold today, it would. It would cost a lot of money, be marketed as artisan and eco-friendly thermal shielding, and sell out right away to rich people who say they love nature but freak out when they see a bug. The teepee didn't just use buffalo hides, It used them to their full potential. The buffalo hide exterior was the teepee's heavy winter coat, and the inner lining was the hidden layer of engineering genius that most people don't see. At first glance, it looks simple, just another layer of hide or cloth hanging on the inside walls. But in reality, this lining changed the tipi from a very good shelter to a place that was warmer than a colonial cabin built by a dozen men with axes and hope. The lining made a double wall insulation system. This wasn't guesswork, it was planned and improved over generations. One layer of hide on the outside kept out wind, snow, and whatever weather was trying to ruin someone's week. The inner lining, which was a few inches inside, made a pocket of air between the two layers. That air pocket worked just like the insulation in modern homes, except without fiberglass, foam, or the existential dread of home repair bills. When the central fire burned, warm air rose naturally and slipped upward between the lining and the outer cover, circulating in a controlled cycle. Instead of escaping into the night or getting trapped at the top of the teepee, that warm air was guided downward along the interior, maintaining a consistent and comfortable temperature inside. The result was a convection system so efficient that even harsh winter. The inner lining also helped control smoke. Instead of drifting sideways across the floor and making everyone cough like they were auditioning for a 19th century drama, the smoke was funneled upward toward the smoke hole where the adjustable flaps let it out. The system balanced airflow. Fresh air came in from the bottom edge of the teepee, warmed by the fire and the inner lining. Air pocket, and rose upward, pushing smoke out while keeping heat in. From a practical standpoint, the lining also prevented drafts from racing along the ground, a problem that plagued European-style dwellings. Cold air simply couldn't sweep across the floor when the lining gently redirected it upward into the warm airflow. Floors covered with hides and mats benefited even more from this controlled movement, creating a surprisingly cozy environment. The brilliance of the lining came from its. In winter, it could be fully lowered to keep the heat in. In summer, it could be raised to let in air. Everything about it was adjustable, responsive, and designed to work with nature instead of against it. There were no extra materials, no wasted space, and no fights with the weather. Just smart, efficient engineering woven deeply into everyday life. One of its most overlooked but brilliant features is the smoke flaps at the top of each teepee. To an untrained eye, they might look decorative, two triangular pieces of hide flapping politely in the wind. But to anyone who has ever lived through a winter fire in an enclosed space, these flaps are nothing short of heroic. They are in essence the type's climate control system. Centuries before anyone invented thermostats, chimneys, or the modern obsession with smart home technology, the smoke flaps controlled the ventilation of the teepee. When the central fire burned, usually small, steady, and well managed, it produced smoke that naturally rose toward the top of the structure. Without a way to guide that smoke out, the inside would quickly look like a wood-fired sauna that had gone horribly wrong. But the flaps worked like an adjustable chimney, directing the smoke upward and outward. By using two long poles, the flaps could be opened, closed, or angled in certain directions depending on the wind. If the wind changed, which it often did on the plains, usually with the enthusiasm of someone slamming a door, the flaps could be moved to make sure the smoke escaped efficiently. This let fresh air in from the bottom and warm air flow in a controlled way. What makes this design so smart is how responsive it is. The flaps didn't need ropes, gears, pulleys, or complicated mechanical systems. They just needed two poles and an understanding of how the wind worked. With a quick adjustment, the whole airflow of the teepee could be changed. At the same time, European settlers were building square houses with chimneys that often got clogged, smoked, or fell down under snow because they weren't made with the local weather in mind. The smoke flaps were also important for keeping the temperature stable. Opening them wide lets heat escape, which cools the tipi in the summer. Closing them lets the tipi keep heat better. In winter, when temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees and the outside world felt like a hostile refrigerator, careful flap adjustments kept the inside warm without suffocating the people inside. Their placement at the top of the cone was intentional. The rising warm air created a natural draft that pulled smoke upward. The flaps acted as directional vents, using this upward flow to clean the air inside while keeping it comfortable. No trapped smoke, no wasted heat, and no need to build a chimney taller than the house itself. In short, the smoke flaps turned the top of the teepee from just an opening into a dynamic, elegant, low-tech masterpiece of environmental control. Simple, effective, and reliable. A solution so smart that even today, architects study it with interest and maybe a little jealousy. A small, steady fire burned in the middle of every teepee, both literally and figuratively. It wasn't a roaring bonfire or a dramatic blaze fit for a fantasy movie. It was a carefully controlled hearth that provided warmth, light, and a place to cook without turning the whole structure into a smoke chamber or an emergency situation. The central hearth was the quiet workhorse of teepee life, doing everything a European fireplace did, but with far fewer structural complaints. The fire was placed in the center was not an accident. It made sure that the heat was evenly spread, the smoke moved quickly, and the distance from the walls was safe. If you've ever set a fire too close to something that could catch fire, like a curtain, a log cabin wall, or your own dignity, you know how important this design choice is. Because of the way the tipi was shaped, the fire's heat could rise straight up, collect under the smoke hole, and move through the warm air channels made by the inner lining. A small fire was more than sufficient. It wasn't necessary to have a huge fire in the teepee to keep it warm at 30 degrees, because the structure itself did most of the work. A small fire could make the inside surprisingly comfortable, something that confused early Europeans who thought you needed to build a fire big enough to melt the Arctic. Instead of using brute force, the teepee relied on efficiency. This is a lesson that modern heating systems could learn from. The hearth served many purposes. It gave off light at night, heat for cooking, and heat for sleeping. It could have pots hanging over it. You could roast food next to it, and in an emergency, it could be used as a simple drying machine, necessary in a place where wet clothes weren't just a pain, but also a health risk. Even with all of this use, the fire stayed very contained. The smoke hole and flaps kept things from building up, and the lining helped direct air up, so the people inside didn't have to cough or squint through a fog of burnt wood all the time. But the best thing about the hearth system was how well it worked with the shape of the types. The warm air rising made a natural current that pulled fresh air from the bottom edge of the type. This made a ventilation cycle that worked on its own and didn't need any chimneys, metal pipes, or trips to the roof in the winter to clear anything. It was easy to take care of and quick to change. It was, in short, a great example of how careful design can help people feel safe and comfortable, instead of a lot of force. The central hearth didn't take over the tipi. It went well with it. It wasn't just warm inside a winter tipi. It was planned, purposeful, and surprisingly comfortable. If you've ever lived in a modern apartment that was clearly designed by someone who hates people, you'll understand how well the inside of a teepee used space. There was no randomness. Nothing was pushed into a corner because everything had a reason, and that reason was usually supported warmth, togetherness, or survival, and it would be best if all three. The way the rooms were set up made sense based on how people had done it for generations. There were sleeping areas around the edges where hides and furs kept the ground warm from the cold outside. This ring of bedding made the room warmer and served as a natural barrier, giving each person their own space, even though the floor plan was open. And to be honest, it used space better than most studio apartments. Also, no one was fighting with the landlord about the heat. At the center was the hearth, the teepee's sun, and the gravity well that held everything together. People went there to cook, talk, make tools, fix clothes, tell stories, and sometimes wonder why the wind outside sounded like it was trying to file a complaint. The circular shape made it easier for people to make eye contact and talk to each other, which is something that designers of open concept homes keep trying and failing to do. The tipi worked so well as a community space because everyone felt equal inside. There were no cold corners, no isolated nooks, and no darker, slightly suspicious areas like in a log cabin. The convection between the inner lining and outer cover warmed up the whole space. This meant that no one ever had to sleep in the drafty area, which was also known as the spot where Europeans put their least favorite family members. Hooks, poles, and lines made it easy to store things along the walls. There was a place for everything, like tools, clothes, bags, and cooking items. You could even hang drying racks for wet clothes from the poles above, using the warm air that rises. A teepee could change from a living room to a bedroom to a workshop to a kitchen to a gathering hall without ever feeling cramped. But the real magic was how the structure helped people connect with each other. The warmth made people want to talk. The round shape made people want to join in. There was room for rituals, stories, lessons, singing, and laughter in the open space. The storm outside was like an angry opera singer. A winter teepee was more than just a place to stay. It was a place to live and breathe, a space for people to breathe, a place where families not only survived the cold, but also lived their lives in it. The aerodynamic design, the smoke control engineering, or even the buffalo hide insulation were not the most impressive things about the winter teepee. No, it was because people inside didn't have to sit, sleep, or walk on frozen ground like penguins who didn't want to. The floor of a winter teepee was its own way of keeping warm, comfortable, and useful, turning cold ground into something that was surprisingly warm and comfortable in minus 30 degrees. That's nothing short of a small miracle. There were mats, brush, or grass on the floor to keep the living space and the ground apart. This first layer worked like a buffer zone. The diplomat is keeping the freezing ground from declaring war on everyone's feet. Putting mats or brush directly on the ground also kept moisture from rising, which is important because there are few things worse than finding out that your bedding has turned into a sponge in the winter is not fun. Animal hides, like buffalo robes or deer hides, were put on top of this first layer. These hides not only kept people warm, but they were also softer than the hard floors in European cabins of the same time. Even now, walking on a warm fur surface on a cold morning feels great. It wasn't a luxury in a teepee. It was a stylish way to stay alive. These hides also made an insulating pocket, just like modern flooring methods do. The warm air from the central fire moved down and across the floor layers, making the space under the sleeping areas surprisingly nice. This was more than just better than the cold ground. It was really warm. The kind of warm where you can sit comfortably while the outside world tries to look like a frozen wasteland. The floor plan was another smart feature because it was so flexible. If the weather changed, more people came, or storage needed to be rearranged, you could move the hides around. With ease, the sleeping areas could be made bigger or smaller. You could add more furs on top of each other for more insulation. The floor wasn't a fixed thing. It changed as quickly as the teepee did. There was also a practical hygiene benefit. Someone always brings something inside, whether it's snow or mud. You could pick up, shake, clean, or dry the hides near the fire. Give that a try with a colonial-style wooden floor. Spoiler alert, things don't go well. The floor as a whole. The system worked well with the Tipis thermal design. The hides kept the heat in, and the lining let the air flow. The family was safe from the terrible cold outside, thanks to everything. So, while the wind tried to turn the plains into a frozen battlefield, the people inside sat on warm ground, wrapped in comfort, proving once again that good design beats brute force every time. The teepee's ability to stay warm, let smoke out, and keep cool were all amazing, but the most amazing thing about it was it handled minus 30 degrees very well. No, the real twist is that the whole thing could be moved, and not really portable like modern furniture says it is, which usually means you'll wish you hadn't done this in 10 minutes. The teepee was really easy to move, simple to take apart, pack, move, and put back together. It was the opposite of what a European cabin was. A family that had done it a lot could take down a teepee in less than an hour. The poles were unfastened, the hide covering was folded, and the inside lining was packed, and the household goods were put together in a way that made sense. No nails to pull out, no beams to deal with, and no roofs that fall in the middle of the process. The design remembered something that Europeans often forgot. People move, animals move, seasons change, and food sources change. A home should change with life, not keep people in one place. A travois, a simple but effective sled-like frame pulled by dogs in the past, and horses now, was used to move the teepee parts once they were taken apart. Start. The poles themselves often served as the travo's rails, showing once more that every part of the teepee could be used for more than one thing. There was no waste. There was nothing decorative. Everything had a reason for being there. At the same time, European settlers were cutting down trees to make wooden houses that they left behind a year later because they were in bad places. But what really makes the teepee special is how easy it is to put back together. The same family that took it down in less than an hour could have it back up, standing again by noon. Poles set up, covering for the hide put in place, lining hung, and half of the hearth lit. Think about moving your whole house in the time it takes most people to put together one piece of flat pack furniture. And without the emotional damage, moving around wasn't a luxury. It was a necessary part of life. You had to move because of hunting patterns, seasons, water availability, and resource cycles. Families could follow the land without giving up comfort, thanks to the tipi. You don't have to choose between warmth and movement. You don't have to pull a wooden cabin across the plains like a pet that won't listen. The types solved the problem in a smart way. Your home moves with you, not against you. Portability also made people in the community closer. Camps could join forces, grow, merge, or split up as needed. Families could go to seasonal gatherings, ceremonies, or hunts, knowing that their homes would be ready and packed at any time. The tipi's ability to move around wasn't just important in a world shaped by the vastness of the plains. Ease. It was easy to stay alive. You know how one draft can ruin an entire heating system if you've ever lived in a house with a front door that wasn't sealed well. Now picture dealing with that draft, atos 30 degrees, when the wind is blowing at you from the side, like it's angry at you for being alive. The entrance to a winter teepee had to deal with exactly that, and it did so with a kind of quiet, confident brilliance that modern architects could learn from. The first line of defense was orientation. Tipis usually faced east, away from the strong western winds that blew across the plains like an angry bear. It wasn't a belief in magic. It was meteorology long before meteorologists went on TV to make big gestures at moving weather maps. The tipi faced east, which kept the most powerful gusts from hitting it. This made the doorway a controlled entry instead of a wind tunnel. Next was the door flap, a cover for the hide that worked like a flexible, but surprisingly, a good shield. It could be lifted, tied back, weighted, doubled or layered depending on the time of year. The flap moved with the wind instead of pushing against it, which kept the structure from getting too stressed and kept cold air from coming in without permission. In the winter, when storms are really bad, a second flap or more insulation could be added behind the main door to make a small airlock. This two-layer system kept cold air from getting into the main space by trapping it first. Same job as modern vestibules, but you don't need power strips, heaters, or signs that say, "Please close both doors." The teepee's interior lining also played a role inside the entrance. The lining didn't go all the way to the door, but it did help keep cold air from blowing into the living area by directing it downward. Any gust that got past the flap had to behave and was sent into the airflow system, where it became part of the natural convection instead of an uninvited burst of Arctic personality. The doorway was also very low, which was another smart detail. Yes, this meant that you had to bend a little to get in and out. Most people chose warmth over elegance, though, because they didn't want to freeze to death. The low entrance kept a lot of warm air from escaping every time someone came in or out. Overall, the design made a structural weakness into a functional strength. Not just a hole in the wall was the entrance. Wall. It was a man-made barrier against the worst of winter. In a place where one bad draft could ruin the whole night, the tippy door didn't just keep the cold out, it also kept the comfort in. Going into a well-built winter tippy when it's minus 30 degrees is a lot like stepping into a plot twist. You think you'll suffer. You think your eyelashes will freeze. You expect the kind of cold that makes your bones file formal complaints. Instead, you find real warmth and a level of comfort that would make. Many European settlers stare in shock, and then they quietly realize that they have been living all wrong. A winter tippy did more than just keep the cold out. It made a small climate inside. The buffalo hide outside, the insulated inside, the central hearth, and the carefully controlled airflow made the inside so comfortable that people could take off their outer layers, work freely, and sleep without shaking like poorly wrapped burritos. This amount of control over the environment. Indigenous engineering has done some really amazing things, like building things without metal stoves, electric heaters, or a stack of firewood the size of a small village. The hearth let in light that passed through the hide covering, making the room glow with a warm amber light. It's like choosing the cozy lighting option on a smart bulb, but the bulb is your whole house. Shadows moved slowly along the walls, making the room feel like it was flickering, which was perfect for telling stories, teaching, making tools, or just passing the time. While the world outside tried to freeze itself solid, storage was neatly hung from the poles, keeping tools, bags, and other items off the ground. This extra organization also helped keep the air flowing around the walls, which kept the convection system that made the types so useful. There was no mess. There was no feeling of being crowded. It was a space that was made on purpose, not a random collection of things fighting for space, which is what a lot of modern living rooms look like. There was a ring of sleeping areas around The outer edge was covered in hides and furs to keep the heat in. The floor system worked with the heated airflow to keep these sleeping areas noticeably warmer than the central walkway. While blizzards howled outside like a choir of angry wolves, families could sleep soundly, wrapped up in warmth. What might surprise people today the most is how comfortable the space felt. This wasn't just getting by. This was living, cooking, fixing clothes, and making things. Tools, singing, telling stories, teaching lessons, and cooking. The howling cold outside the teepee walls didn't bother daily life at all. The winter teepee didn't just keep people safe from the weather, it made a safe place, a bubble of warmth and community in a world that needed strength. A home where life went on even though winter tried its hardest to stop it. When European settlers first saw winter teepees, a lot of them reacted like someone does when they realized that their expensive, high-tech phone can't do something that a cheap, older model can do easily. Confusion, denial, and then, grudgingly, respect. Before that, most Europeans thought that good houses needed thick walls, heavy timber, small windows, and enough smoke inside to make every meal taste like an accidental barbecue. The teepee didn't agree, but it went on to do better than these houses in almost every way that mattered at minus 30 degrees. Take a look at the average settler cabin. Constructed quickly, usually without knowing much about the local weather, it tended to have gaps between logs that were big enough for wind to get through. The roofs leaked, the chimneys smoked, the floors froze, and the wind whistled through the walls like a rude dinner guest. And every winter, families found new and fun ways to regret the choices they made when building their homes. In comparison to a teepee in the winter, it is aerodynamic, insulated, portable, breathable, warm, and has a flexible structure. The teepee wasn't. Trying to fight the wind, it sent it somewhere else. It didn't keep the smoke in until half the family had to cough themselves to sleep. It vented cleanly through a system that could be changed. When a lot of snow fell, it didn't fall down. It lost weight so easily that even gravity seemed to be impressed. The teepee was better at keeping heat in. A small fire could heat the whole inside without wasting fuel. At the same time, European settlers needed a lot of wood that could also be used as small fortifications just to keep their homes from getting too cold, like in the Arctic. They spent whole days chopping and stacking wood and arguing about whether they had enough. Meanwhile, the people living in the teepee just tended a small fire and went about their lives. Then there is mobility, which was something that European architecture had never seen before. After a cabin was built, it was stuck to that piece of land forever. For better or worse, mostly worse, during bad weather. If hunting. Too bad if patterns changed or water sources moved, the house stayed where it was. The family stopped moving, but the teepee could be taken down, moved, and rebuilt in a new place, which was usually faster than a settler could find a new axe handle. The way each structure reacted to the environment is what really shows the difference. Settler houses fought against nature and lost many times. Teepee worked with nature and did well. In the end, one wasn't just a place to stay, it was a system that worked perfectly on the plains. The other was a box made of wood, full of remorse. When you look at all the parts of the winter teepee, like the aerodynamic cone, the buffalo hide insulation, the inner lining, the smoke flap ventilation, the warm floor system, the central hearth, the directional entrance, and the fact that it can be moved, the picture gets clearer. This wasn't just a place to stay. It was a work of art that had been quietly improved over generations by watching, testing, and refining it. A type of architectural knowledge that was influenced by the surroundings. Most structures around the world change by accident. Someone builds a house, finds out that the roof leaks, makes changes, and the process goes on until the building stops falling on people. But the TP didn't accidentally become great. Every part was planned out. There was no waste. There was no overbuilding. Nothing needed a miracle to work at minus 30 degrees. It was not trial and error architecture. It was a test and a success. The genius is in how all the parts fit together. The form helped the air flow. The lining helped the heating work. The hides held up the insulation. The poles made it easy to move around. The entrance was in line with the wind. The TP worked with nature instead of trying to make it do what people wanted. This usually ends with rickety buildings and unhappy settlers. The plains said, "Yes, that works for us," and they took what they offered. This is very different from how Europeans did things at the time, which was basically to build a box, hope the box stays up. If the box falls down, build another box nearby, and do the same thing again. Meanwhile, the TP was already showing how flexible, adaptable, and efficient it was long before those words became popular in engineering seminars. The TP also did well because it wasn't just a building, it became a part of how people lived. It helped with mobility, community, seasonal movement, hunting cycles, changes in the weather, and spiritual practices. A house was more than just a place to sleep. It let families and whole countries follow the land's rhythms. The teepee didn't fight the cold when winter came. It was smarter than it. Even architects who study sustainable design today are often quietly impressed. Not many people will admit that their favorite climate-responsive building is hundreds of years old and doesn't use metal screws or reinforced concrete. But the truth is there. The teepee is still one of the best portable homes ever made. In the end, the winter. At 30 degrees, a teepee didn't just keep people alive. It let them live well, warm, strong, and in harmony with a landscape that was strong enough to punish any mistakes in design. That's what makes the teepee so beautiful. A simple frame, a humble shape, and a brilliance that still shines today. In the far north, winter never came in quietly. It came down like a slow-moving beast, taking minutes of daylight, one by one, until the sun barely touched the horizon. For Viking groups living in Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, the darkest weeks of the year were more than just a hassle. They were a test of how long you could last. It took a long time to harvest crops. The seas were dangerous, and the world outside the longhouse felt like it had stopped. This was the setting for Joel, the Yule season, a festival made not just to celebrate, but also to keep the spirit alive. As the longest night drew near, people felt both fear and determination. The sun wasn't just hiding from them, it was getting weaker. Each shorter day hinted at a cosmic battle between light and the powers that wanted to eat it. The Vikings were known for being practical, but they were also very spiritual. They believed in unseen forces that controlled the rhythm of the world. Joel gave them a way to change that rhythm, or at least make them think they could. They tried to bring the sun back from the edges of the void through rituals, fire, feasting, sacrifice, and stories. Weeks before, people started getting ready. Families dried meat, brewed meat, and brought their animals into warm enclosures, choosing the strongest animals to breed and the weakest to kill when the time comes. But the boar was the most important animal. The boar was strong, stubborn, and sacred to the god Friar. It stood for fertility, strength, and new beginnings. Everything the community wanted during the coldest part of winter. Offering a boar at Yule was a way to symbolically feed the cycle of nature and bring the sun back to life. Inside the long house, excitement grew. New pine. The pillars were decorated with branches, and the smell of the branches mixed with the smoke from the wood. People told kids stories about winters long ago, brave ancestors, and gods who fought frost giants to keep the world safe. The crackling hearth became the center of life, giving off warmth and comfort. Hope stayed alive as long as the fire did. That was the heart of Yule. The Vikings dared to get together, eat, and celebrate the new year in a world where darkness seemed to last forever. They thought that even the smallest flame, whether in a hearth or a heart, it could fight the longest night and bring the sun back slowly and triumphantly. There was one ritual that was more important to Joel than any other. The boar was killed as a gift to Friar, the god of fertility, peace, and prosperity. Friar wasn't just a god to the Vikings. He was the one who promised the harvest for the next year, the quiet force behind warm summers, fertile fields, and the rebirth of all living things. When winter came and food supplies ran low, as the sun went down, paying tribute to Freya became a matter of both respect and survival. The chosen boar, which was often the best animal a household could raise, was treated with great respect. In some places, it was groomed and decorated with wreaths or ribbons as a way to show respect for its role in keeping the community alive. This wasn't a mindless act of killing. It was a serious trade, one life for another, with the hope that life would go on. Before the sacrifice, the boar was brought in front of the whole clan, where people put their hands on its bristled back and made a ul oath, which could be a promise to be brave, to do something in the coming season, or to end fights once the snow melted. These oaths were binding because they were made in front of the gods, ancestors, and family. Breaking them was a sin that brought shame and, worse, God's anger. After the sacrifice was over, the blood of the boar was gathered and sprinkled on carved wooden idols, ceremonial stones, and even the people who took part. People thought that this act, called Bali, make the connection between humans and the divine stronger. Then, the meat was roasted over an open fire, and the smell of pine and smoke mixed with it, making the long house smell rich and warm, which made the outside seem less harsh for a while. The feast that came after was shared by everyone, and every slice of boar had meaning. Eating it meant getting Freya's blessing and sharing in the hope that the fields would grow again and the sun would get stronger. People told the kids that the spirit of the boar would run across the sky, leading the light back to the world of people. In this way, the sacrifice of the boar was more than just a ritual. It was a promise that the Vikings would get through the darkness of winter with strength, and a request that the gods would reward their loyalty with plenty when spring came back. If the boar sacrifice was Joel's holy heart, then I was its golden lifeblood. For Vikings, me wasn't just a drink. It was a gift from the gods, a sign of joy, creativity, and the power of the group. Me was made from honey, water, and often herbs or berries. It was like the stored sweetness of the year, like sunlight turned into liquid warmth, and the frozen depths of winter were the best time to let that warmth out. The mead flowed freely inside the long house. People passed around huge drinking horns that were often carved with patterns of snakes and runes. Each person took a turn drinking, following rules and customs that strengthened their bond. No one drank by themselves. A horn raised was a sign to come. Sometimes they did it to honor the gods, other times to honor their ancestors, and other times just to be thankful for living another year. The Vikings thought that drinking together brought people together and broke down the walls that hardship built. The longhouse came to life as the fire roared in the middle hearth. Shadows danced along the wooden beams, flickering like ghosts that had come to the party. Me loosened tongues, thawed frozen spirits, and changed the somberness of sacrifice into celebration, faces red from the heat and the drinks. Warriors told stories about battles in a fun way that made them sound bigger than they were. Farmers were very hopeful about next year's harvest, and fishermen bragged about how they had survived storms. As the night went on, the laughter got louder, and for a few precious hours, the problems of winter seemed far away. But drinking wasn't just a treat for me. It was a way to let go of stress that had become a habit, a mental shield against the boringness of the season. Each hornful gave you strength, bravery to put up with the cold, courage to face the unknown in the coming months, and courage to believe in a new beginning. The scolds, storytellers, and poets all looked to me for inspiration because they thought it opened their minds to the wisdom of Odin himself. And even though there was a lot of it, it wasn't totally out of control. The symbol leader, who was in charge of the horn, made sure that the toasts were respectful and that the drinking brought people closer together instead of tearing them apart. With this advice, Joel Me feasts became acts of cultural strength. The Vikings fought back against the darkness of winter by making their own light in the long house, which was warmed by fire and fortified by honey drink. As the Emmy loosened tongues and the firelight softened the edges of the long house, another important part of Joel came out: storytelling. Words were more than just fun for the Vikings. They were living things that could change memory, identity, and even fate. And to be honest, I think this was one of the strongest parts of the culture of the Vikings. They didn't use books or libraries. People cared enough to say their history out loud year after year, which is why it lived on. The Skolds, who were elite poets and lawkeepers, had a presence in the room that was as strong as any warrior's. They carried stories in their heads, like others carry swords, with care, skill, and a sense of duty. During Joel, when things were dark and the world seemed uncertain, it was the skulls that reminded everyone that their ancestors had been through the same things. Fears and lived, they were like psychological armor in a way. In my opinion, every society that makes it through hard times has storytellers, people who turn pain into something useful. Some of the stories were grand, while others were more personal. One moment, the long house was filled with the sound of Thor fighting giants, and the next, it was quiet as stories of lost family or heroic journeys made people feel things. The kids listened with wide eyes, taking in everything like snow catching firelight. Adults nodded along, knowing common themes: bravery in the face of winter, loyalty to family, and the thin line between life and death. But these stories weren't old things. They changed with each telling. A scold might change a story to talk about something that just happened, honor a local hero, or make fun of someone in the room in a light-hearted way. This is something I really like about myself. The Vikings knew that history is not set in stone. It's a conversation between the past and the present, shaped by what people need now. Telling stories during Joel had a deeper purpose as well. It reminded the people that they were part of something bigger than themselves. In the middle of winter, when being alone could bring down morale, sagas brought everyone together in a shared mythic world. They strengthened values, kept memories alive, and gave people hope. I think it's not a coincidence that cultures with strong oral traditions tend to be very strong. They know how to turn fear into a story, and a story into strength. As the wind howled outside and snow piled up against, the Vikings sat against the walls, wrapped in the warmth of words, sure that stories could outshine even the darkest night. Joel was a time of feasting and partying, but at its heart, it was still a religious event. The Vikings didn't just think of winter as a season, they thought of it as a cosmic event that both people and gods had to pay attention to. And to be honest, this way of looking at the world makes a lot of sense to me. When you live in a place where the sun almost never comes out, you can feel the weight of the universe in your bones. Joel's main idea was that the sun was having a hard time. Every day that got shorter was a sign that the forces of darkness, frost giants, chaotic spirits, and cosmic entropy were getting stronger. Joel's rituals, especially those that took place during the solstice, were meant to help the sun get its strength back. Not only did torches, bonfires, and hearth flames give off heat, they were like symbolic lights, small echoes of the heavenly fire they hoped would come back soon. People from different neighborhoods came together to pray, give food and drink to the gods, especially Odin, Thor, and Freya. People prayed to Odin for wisdom and safety, Thor for strength against the cold that made life hard, and Freyr for the promise of fertile lands when spring came back. I find it interesting how the Vikings' religious life mixed real life with myth. They prayed to the powers that controlled the things they needed most, like food, warmth, and the safety of their clan. Faith wasn't a luxury in a harsh world, it was a plan. The night of the solstice, it had a strong electric atmosphere. People looked up at the sky and listened for signs, thinking that the veil between worlds got thinner during Joel. Some people thought they would see spirits of their ancestors. Some people thought that the gods rode through the night sky on the wild hunt, a stormy procession that could bless or scare you, depending on your luck. And to be honest, if you've ever been outside during a winter storm in the north, you can see why they thought there were supernatural riders in the wind. It feels like it's from another world. The mood changed when the solstice was over and the sun started to get stronger again. This turning point was a psychological win. The worst was over. The light was coming back. The offerings, prayers, and rituals weren't just for the gods. They had kept the community going through the dark winter months. In this way, Joel wasn't just about worship. It was a celebration of strength, a reminder that even in the darkest night, renewal was on its way. Outside, Jule was a time for sacrifice, storytelling, and ritual, but it was also a time for simple human joy, games, gifts, and the strengthening of clan ties. And to be honest, I think this is one of the most underrated parts of Viking culture. We often picture them as serious warriors with axes in their hands stomping through the snow. But during Joel, they let themselves be fun, kind, and even sentimental. Once the feasting settled into a warm hum, families inside the longhouse started to play games. Some were board games like Hennefuffle, strength tests that let young men show off after a few horns of me, and competitive wrestling matches. Some were funny and meant to make people laugh at a time of year when emotional warmth was just as important as physical warmth. The kids ran around the fireplace after each other, adults teased each other, and even older people joined in with wry smiles. I think these funny moments show more about how strong the Vikings were than any story of battle. They wouldn't let. Winter took away their humanity. Giving gifts was also a part of the celebration. Viking gifts were usually useful, unlike the fancy modern holiday traditions. Carved wooden toys for kids, warm mittens, new tools, decorations, or simple charms to keep them safe. Sometimes a beautifully made knife or piece of jewelry was given away, but the meaning of the gift was more important than the gift itself. Gifts were a way for the clan to show their appreciation, loyalty, and the strength of the ties that kept them alive. I really like this way of giving gifts. It is a lot better for our health than what we do now. The Vikings weren't trying to show off. They were trying to make their relationships stronger. Families also had a tradition called elf blot, in which they left food or drink out for elves, household spirits, or land veterans who were thought to protect the home. People may have really thought that invisible beings would eat the offerings, or they may have just wanted to show their thanks in a symbolic way. Either way, the practice made the human world and the unseen forests around them feel more connected. I I really like this idea. It shows that the Vikings knew that no one could survive on their own, not even humans. In the end, Joel's games and gifts weren't just little things he did on the side. They were like emotional glue. They reminded the people that even though winter might be hard, life still had its good times, funny moments, and friends. In the darkest season, family ties became a kind of light. Fire was the most important symbol for Joel, both physically and spiritually. The Vikings thought of fire as more than a way to get warm. It was a living thing that protected them from the darkness that crept in during the winter. And to be honest, I think they were right. If you've ever sat next to a fire on a cold night, you know that the warmth feels good, both physically and emotionally. It makes you feel better in a way that nothing else can. During Joel, families and whole communities lit big fires that were meant to sound like the sun coming back to life. People walked in a line with torches. They put fresh logs on the hearths, and in some places, for days on end, a huge Yule log, which was often a whole tree trunk, was burned. Keeping the flame alive stood for both staying strong and moving forward. The people would also survive the longest nights if the fire did. I really like this symbolism. It makes the simple act of staying warm a group statement of hope. The Yule log had many meanings. Some people thought it kept bad things from happening in the home. Some people thought that the sparks that flew up carried good luck to the gods. People kept the ashes from the burned log too, spread it out in fields, thinking it would make the soil fertile in the spring. Even when we look at this practice from a modern point of view, it's nice to think of winter rituals as a way to prepare for future harvests. It shows how the Vikings saw every moment, good or bad, as part of the cycle of life. Fire also made a line between the holy and the normal. People thought that the veil between worlds got thinner as the flames flickered against the walls of the long house, and the smoke made shapes that changed. Ancestors could come close. Wandering, spirits might stay around, and gods might watch from the light. And to be honest, I can see how easy it would be for the mind to slip into that mystical space on a long winter night with wind and cracking ice. The light from a fire makes the world seem both bigger and smaller at the same time. The Vikings tried to fight the dark with light by making fires, like small hearth flames or huge bonfires, not passively, but actively, almost defiantly. They couldn't stop the sun from coming back, but they were able to make their own light. That simple act is, in many ways, the heart of human strength. We light a fire and choose to keep going when the world gets dark. Inside the long house, Joel felt warm and happy, but people thought the world outside was much less stable. The Vikings thought that the line between the real world and the supernatural world was thinner in the winter. The wild hunt, a loud and scary event, was one of the most dramatic beliefs connected to Joel. A spectral procession that was said to sweep across the sky, with Odin himself at the head. If you've ever been outside during a violent winter storm and felt the wind tear past you like galloping hooves, you can see where this idea came from. The wild hunt was a strange thing. It was scary, awe-inspiring, and strangely comforting all at the same time. Odin rode Sleipnir, his eight-legged horse, and was joined by dead warriors, restless spirits, and even mythical beasts at times. People thought it was important to see it, risky. People thought it was dumb to ignore it. People stayed inside, whispering prayers and hoping that the angry host would go by without taking anyone with them. I think this belief is interesting because it shows how the Vikings saw nature. Weather wasn't the only thing that storms were. They were signs, warnings, or messages from God. There were other strange things that happened with Joel besides the wild hunt. A lot of Vikings thought that the spirits of their ancestors came back during this time, drawn by the warmth of the hearth and the gifts left in their name. Families set aside a seat, food, or drink near the fire. These gestures, whether they were meant literally or symbolically, made the link between the living and the dead stronger. A reminder that identity goes beyond just one life. Some families did rituals for house spirits, like the Dyer or L'Envetier, because they thought that honoring them kept the peace in the home. I really like how well-rounded this way of looking at the world is. Instead of thinking of spirits as... The Vikings didn't see threats as enemies. They saw them as partners, guardians of place, memory, and family wealth. The night sky became a part of the mythic world. People thought that strange lights, storms, and clouds that changed were signs. We now know that the northern lights are caused by science, but many people thought they were the Valkyries riding to battle. And to be honest, I can't blame them. If you didn't have a scientific explanation and saw the sky light up with green fire and warrior maidens riding across it, would you? Would probably think that was a perfectly reasonable way to look at it. Joel became more than just a seasonal festival because of these beliefs. It turned into a cosmic drama, a reminder that people were never really alone in the dark of winter. As winter slowly let go of its icy grip and the days began to get longer, the spirit of Joel stayed with them. The festival wasn't just a time for the Vikings to celebrate. It was a philosophical statement about what it means to go through hard times. And to be honest, I think this is why we are still interested in Joel today. It wasn't built on having a lot of money or things. It was built on the ideas of scarcity, resilience, and the basic human need to bring light into dark times. What makes Joel so interesting is how it changed over time. When Christianity spread to Scandinavia, many pagan customs easily became part of the new Christmas traditions. The festival's timing, the feasts, the fires, and even the idea of giving gifts all fit into a Christian framework. But the old meanings didn't go away. They hid. Underneath the surface, changing the textures of winter celebrations all over Northern Europe. I think this mix of cultures is beautiful. New traditions didn't erase the past. They built on it, letting people keep both their old and new identities. For example, the Yule log. We think of it as a dessert or a way to decorate a fireplace today, but it started with Viking families feeding a huge wooden trunk into the hearth to keep the symbolic flame going for days. Or, think about the boar's head, which was once the most important part of Freyr's sacrifice, and is now only faintly heard in medieval English feasting traditions. The idea of getting together, drinking, telling stories, and strengthening ties during the darkest days of winter is still the same. When the world is cold, people still want warmth and company. These traditions have lasted for a long time, which shows how well Joel understood the rhythms of human life. It was about hope at its core, which is something that every culture knows. The Vikings didn't celebrate because life was hard. They had a party because life was hard, and I think that's the best way to celebrate. It stands up to them, it's emotional, it reminds us that happiness and struggle are not the same thing. It's how people deal with it. When we light candles, get together with friends and family, or tell old stories by the fire in the winter, we're doing things that people have done for thousands of years. We may not be afraid that the sun will never come back, but the instinct to keep fighting against the dark. And that is Joel's most important legacy. A festival that taught people how to not only get through the winter, but also how to make it meaningful, communal, and deeply human. People who stood outside the walls of a medieval castle thought it looked like a place of quiet power, a proud banner flying high above thick stone walls and tall towers. But anyone who lived inside those walls, especially the guards, knew what was really going on. There was no castle, a calm place to stay. It was a pressure cooker made for war, fear, and always being ready. And to be honest, I think being a castle guard was one of the most stressful jobs in the whole medieval world. You weren't just keeping a building safe, you were guarding a sign of power, money, and political pride. That meant you couldn't make even one mistake. A guard's day started early, sometimes even before the sun came up. The kitchen of the castle woke up, and the craftsmen got their tools ready. The guards were already checking their gear, tightening their straps, sharpening their blades, and getting ready for inspection. The castle constable or sergeant was in charge of assignments. They decided who would patrol the courtyard, watch the walls, stand at the gatehouse, and go to the towers. Rotations were important. Boredom made people tired. Too much excitement led to carelessness. I think it's amazing how well medieval leaders understood how people acted long before psychology became a thing. Was there? A guard had to be both visible and alert inside the walls. Anyone who came to the store, sent a message, or worked there could be a threat. People who lived in the castle were also not above suspicion. Guards looked for strange behavior, people who are out late at night or who hang around too close to restricted areas. A guard with sharp eyes saw something that didn't look right and ruined more than one medieval plot. People ate quickly, and often while standing. There were regular training drills, archery, practice handling weapons, formation drills, and responding to alarms in an emergency. A guard was never really at ease. He was always ready to some extent. And unlike the knights who rode into battle with honor and glory, guards were expected to do their jobs without making a big deal out of it. No one praised them when everything went well. Everyone blamed them if something went wrong. But the truth is that these men were much more important to castles than their knights were. The guards were the ones who kept the peace, watched the gates, and stayed alert during the long stretches of quiet when danger seemed far away but never went away. They lived in a world where routine, discipline, and the constant knowledge that even the calmest day could turn deadly at any moment were all important. The gatehouse was the castle's front line during times of peace. This building was the most important choke point in the whole fortress, but it's not often shown in movies. Every person, every part, every animal, and every bit of news that came through it. Honestly, I think being on gatehouse duty was both the most interesting and the most nerve-wracking job a guard could have. You were the castle's filter, letting in only certain things and keeping others out. The gatehouse was more than just a door. It was a gauntlet with armor on it. Guards were on many levels, keeping an eye on things through arrow slits, tower windows, and parapets. Underneath them were murder holes, which were small holes in the ceiling that let boiling water, hot sand, or stones fall on intruders if they attack. And yes, even though modern myths say otherwise, hot oil was not often used because it was too expensive. I think this detail is very funny. Even in war, practicality came before drama. The main gate was strengthened with iron bands and a heavy portcullis, which was a spiked metal grid that could slam down in seconds. It was important to trust the guard who was in charge of the winch. He could let people in, trap them, or seal the door with just one pull of a rope or release of a lever. Fortress. The power and duty were huge. There was just as much going on at the gatehouse every day. Guards asked travelers questions as they arrived. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you want to do here? They searched carts for hidden weapons, asked for written permission to enter, and kept a close eye on anyone who seemed nervous or was trying to avoid them. Smugglers, spies, angry peasants, and thieves who see a chance. Anyone could be a danger, and I think this level of social filtering would drive most people today crazy. But for guards in the Middle Ages, it was just part of the job. Nobles always made things tense. Their entourage caused traffic jams, horses reared, servants panicked, and everyone, even the guards, was expected to be perfectly disciplined. A single mistake, insult, or even an unplanned delay could get you in trouble. The gatehouse was also where news first came in. Rumors of war, diplomats coming to visit, the plague spreading, or sudden political drama. Guards heard bad news hours before the Lord did. In that way, they were more than just guards. They were the castle's first line of defense. The gatehouse was a test of a guard's instincts, discipline, and bravery. It was the castle's way of connecting with the outside world and sometimes protecting it. One of the most boring but important things a guard had to do was walk around the castle walls. Guards walked the battlements, which are stone paths along the tops of the walls, hour after hour, looking for threats that were close by and far away. It may seem simple, but wall patrols needed to have sharp eyes, calm nerves, and an almost unnatural ability to deal with boredom. I think this job was meant to break anyone who wasn't mentally strong. You lost your focus if it was too quiet. You probably died if it was too eventful. The patrol route usually started at one of the corner towers and went all the way around the outside. Along the way, guards looked through arrow slits, leaned over crenellations to see the countryside, and looked for movement on roads, in forests, and in fields. A single person walking toward the castle might not be dangerous, or it could be a scout for a much bigger group. We had to look at every shape on the horizon. Every sound was important. A dog barking, smoke in the distance, and a flicker of torchlight. Every little thing could mean trouble. There were patrols in all kinds of weather. The sun was blazing, the fog was freezing, and the sleet, rain, snow, and winds were so strong they could have pushed a man off the wall. And the walls of the Middle Ages didn't help. The stone was cold, the ground was uneven, and the height was scary for anyone who was afraid of heights. I really admire the guards who were able to work up there without constantly thinking about how they would fall into the moat. But the physical challenge was only half of the fight. It was really hard on my mind. The same patrols every day at the same time made a rhythm that lulled the senses. Guards had to fight the dullness that comes with doing the same thing over and over. There was no way to miss a detail. To keep guards on their toes, many castles had specific checkpoints or regular callouts. A sergeant might show up. To test a guard's awareness without warning, ask them what they saw, who was on the road, or if smoke had come from the village nearby. If you fail the test, you might have to clean up muck or, even worse, work the night shift. Even though patrols were boring, they helped guards learn a lot about the world outside the castle. They knew the weather, the traffic patterns, and the land. They were the first to notice when something was wrong, and in the Middle Ages, half of the work was done by instinct. A guard on patrol had to mix discipline with intuition as you scan the landscape where danger could be hiding just beyond the trees. In the end, the castle's heart was the wall patrols, always on guard and absolutely necessary. Night watches were even worse than day patrols. Everything changed when the sun went down behind the hills and the castle fell into darkness. The air got colder, sounds traveled farther, and every shadow seemed to be hiding something dangerous. This was, in my opinion, the most mentally, the hardest part of being a guard. People just aren't made to be alert in complete darkness. But guards in the Middle Ages were expected to do their jobs perfectly. Shifts of 2 to 4 hours were common for night watches. The goal was clear. Don't get too tired, but always keep an eye on the castle. Guards stood on walls, in towers, and at the gatehouse, each holding a lantern or standing near a brazier to keep warm. Light was both good and bad. It helped the guards. See, but it also made them easy to hit. Many people chose to stand half hidden so that their eyes could get used to the dark instead of relying on the flickering flame. Sounds turned into enemies. A loose stone fell from a wall. The wind blew through the trees. A fox crept across the outer yard. People could take any noise as a threat. And to be honest, I can't blame them. In a time of constant war and sudden attacks, being paranoid was a way to stay alive. If a guard ignored something strange, it could spell doom for the whole. castle, guards used tricks to stay awake. They would bite their tongues, walk in circles, say prayers in a whisper, or tap their weapons in time. One of the worst things you could do was fall asleep on the job. In some places, the punishment was to be embarrassed in front of others. In some cases, it meant death. And even though that sounds harsh, one guard who falls asleep could cause a disaster. Night also hid the spies or saboteurs who were coming. Intruders often moved around at night, hoping to get past an unguarded postern, gates, or dark spots on the wall. Guards had to know what was going on both inside and outside the castle. Betrayal was sometimes the bigger threat, with servants being paid to open doors and conspirators whispering in stairwells. I think this threat from within was even scarier. You could get ready for enemies outside. You couldn't have known that a friend would betray you. Even though they were scared, the guards got used to it. Their senses sharpened, and their instincts got better. Over time, night itself became a friend who was always there. They learned how to get around a huge, quiet battlefield. And when the sun finally came up and painted the walls of the castle gold, every guard on duty felt a quiet sense of victory. Another night has passed, and another morning has come. In the Middle Ages, castles didn't have electric lights, radios, or security cameras. Instead, they used identification systems, passwords, signals, and coded routines to tell guards who was allowed in and who wasn't. And to be honest, I think this is one of the smartest and most underappreciated parts of safety at the castle. People think that fighting in the Middle Ages was all about brute strength, but intelligence and subtlety were just as important. The nightly password, which was also called the watchword, was very important. At the start of the evening, every guard on duty learned it. The sergeant would whisper it to the soldier, always out of earshot of strangers. Anyone who came near after dark, even the lord of the castle himself, had to know the password. If they didn't, spears and arrows came down, were knocked, and things got very tense very quickly. I really like how democratic this system was. If the rules said so, a low-ranking guard could even challenge a noble. But passwords weren't the only thing that kept things safe. Guards also used visual signals, like a raised torch, a waved lantern, or a series of horn blasts. These made it easy to talk to each other quickly across the walls and courtyard. A single horn could mean that a patrol is coming back. 2 horns could tell you that someone you don't know is coming. 3 horns, that usually meant bad news. I'm always amazed at how well this system works. They still made reliable communication networks without technology. There were also routines set up to find out who was lying. Some castles made guards walk certain paths at certain times. Something was wrong if a patrol didn't show up when it was supposed to. Others used phrases that were shouted across battlements and then answered. One guard would say a line, and the next tower over would say the same thing in response. This stopped. Attackers could change or kill a watchman without anyone noticing. Inside the castle, both servants and residents needed ways to show they belonged. Some people wore badges or tokens. Some people stuck to the rules about curfews. People who looked familiar could be held until they were verified after dark. I think this level of caution shows how dangerous life was in the Middle Ages. A single moment of misplaced trust could bring down an entire fortress. These password systems weren't just things that had to be done by law, they were tools that save lives. They stopped ambushes, stopped intruders, and gave guards the power to challenge anyone, no matter what their rank was. The humble watchword might have been the only thing that kept a quiet night from turning into a deadly surprise at a time when disguise and deception were common. In short, passwords kept everyone safe and stopped castles from becoming crime scenes with beautiful architecture. Castle towers were more than just interesting parts of the building, they were nerve centers for watching. Anyone who worked in the tower lived in a world of wind, height, and constant watching. And to be honest, I think tower guards had one of the hardest mental jobs. You weren't in the busy courtyard or the warm gatehouse. You were by yourself, often cold, and staring at the horizon for hours, hoping that something would move. Each tower gave a different view. From the top, a lookout could see villages, forests, roads, and sometimes even the shine of a river that was miles away. This wide view made the towers the castle's first line of defense. A plume of smoke, a cloud of dust in the distance, or the way metal sparkles in the sun could all mean trouble is coming. There was a lot of pressure. Think about being the first person to see an army before it got to your walls. Missed the signs, and the castle might only have a few minutes, not hours, to get ready. It was cramped inside the tower. The stone walls kept the cold air in. The staircases twisted tightly, and the arrow slits let in just enough light to see and shoot, to keep warm. Guards took turns warming their fingers near small braziers so they could stay mobile. In my opinion, frostbite was just as dangerous as any enemy siege weapon. But comfort was a luxury. There couldn't be guards from the Middle Ages. Archers who were stationed in towers had even more to do. Their bows were the castle's first line of defense. From above, they could shoot arrows at attackers long before the troops on the ground got to the gate. But archers had to be very good at what they did. When shooting from a height, you had to make adjustments for distance, angle, and wind. One wrong calculation wasted valuable bullets. And during a siege, arrows were as important as food. It was very important for towers to be able to talk to each other. Guards used horn blasts, shouts, or flashes of light from lanterns to tell others what they saw. A shady person near the tree line? Give it a signal. Is a caravan coming? Give it a signal. Something weird is going on in the village? Definitely send a signal. Tower guards became very good at reading the land as if it were a living map. Even though it was lonely, there was a certain pride in doing tower duty. You were literally above everything, closer to the wind, the weather, and the first signs of trouble. I think that the tower guards were the castle's eyes, and without them, all the other ways to protect it would fall apart. Being in the tower meant being alert, paying attention to every little thing, and knowing that even the smallest change could have big effects. If towers were the castle's eyes, then murder holes were its teeth, small, unassuming, and deadly. These building gateways, passageways, and choke points were designed with features that let defenders cause chaos for invaders who were stuck below. And to be honest, I think murder holes are one of the best ways to remember that medieval architects were more than just builders. They were military planners with surprisingly creative minds. A murder hole was usually a small square or round hole in the ceiling above a doorway. If attackers got through the outer gate or broke down a door, they would rush inside, often cheering, thinking they had won the first part of the siege. Then they would be pushed into a narrow hallway where they would be packed in and suddenly soaked in hot sand, stones, boiling water, or even quicklime. I think using hot sand is the most underrated strategy. It got into gaps in armor, stuck to sweaty skin, and burned for weeks. These holes didn't just show up by chance. Castle designers made killing zones on purpose, which are areas designed to trap attackers like bugs in a bottle. Most of the time, the gatehouse was the worst of these. Defender could shoot arrows through arrow slits, pour liquids through murder holes, and drop heavy things from hidden ledges. The shapes were great. It was narrow enough to block enemies, tall enough to make vertical attack angles, and winding enough to confuse anyone who was charging forward. Trapdoors did the same thing. Some were just wooden panels that could be pulled open to drop enemies into pits. Some were hidden under straw, dirt, or even decorative things. Flooring not every time was the goal to kill. It was to split up, slow down, or confuse attackers. Imagine running down a hallway in a castle, your heart racing, and then the floor below you disappears. It's very effective, but it's also very embarrassing and chaotic. What I like most about these features is how they worked on my mind. Even experienced soldiers were unsure about going into a castle's inner passages. They would look up, tap the floor with a spear, or hug the wall to stay away from fake traps. Just being scared slowed, an attack that gave defenders a lot of time to prepare. Not only were murder holes and trapdoors gruesome, they were also very clever. They turned the castle into a weapon, which let a small group of defenders hold off dozens or even hundreds of attackers. And in a world where there weren't many people and sieges were brutal, that edge could mean the difference between living and dying. To put it simply, medieval castles didn't play by the rules, and that was the point. Castle walls and towers kept people safe. Many medieval lords were more afraid of something sneaky than armies from outside, threats from the inside. A castle was a small, busy ecosystem. Servants, cooks, blacksmiths, cleaners, knights, visiting nobles, wandering musicians, clergy, merchants, messengers, stable boys, and prisoners. That meant one scary truth. There were a lot of ways for someone inside to mess things up. And to be honest, I thought this internal threat was much scarier than any siege engine parked outside the gate. Guard. We're taught to look for enemies in the woods and also for strange behavior in the halls. A servant hanging around where they shouldn't be. a scribe suddenly becoming interested in how guards switch places, a merchant who is visiting and asking too many questions. Even loyal servants could be paid off by other lords. Medieval politics made the gossip in modern offices look cute in comparison. Because of this, guards were just as strict on the inside of castles as they were on the outside. They kept an eye on storerooms and checked locks, looked over the stables, and made sure that no one messed with the wells or food. There was a real fear of being poisoned. Some lords even had people whose job it was to taste their food. I think that was the most stressful job in the whole Middle Ages. After that, there were the prisoners. A lot of castles had dungeons or holding cells deep inside them. Guards had to make sure that no one gave prisoners illegal goods. There were no bribes, and no kind servant helped a prisoner get away. One loose brick or a tool that was brought in illegally could turn into a disaster. Servants were necessary, but also dangerous. They could get into almost every room, even the lord's private quarters. Many were loyal, but hunger, fear, or a better offer could make them change their minds. I think this is the part of medieval life that we romanticize the least but should know the most about. Castles worked because a lot of people worked together, but any one of them could become a weakness. Physical security was just as important as information security. Guards made sure that rules were followed about who could listen in on council meetings, who could handle letters, and who could talk to the Lord during breaks. If the wrong person heard it, even casual gossip could start a rebellion. It wasn't cool to work in internal security. There were no big battles or heroic last stands, just constant watchfulness and quiet doubt. But castles would have fallen a lot more often without it. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy didn't need a siege tower. All they needed was a smile, a bribe, or the right time to strike. And I think that's the most disturbing truth. The guards themselves were the true heart of castle security. They were the men who lived on the edge of danger every day. They built their world on discipline, instinct, and trust. And to be honest, I think this human side of things is often ignored. A castle's stone walls didn't keep it safe. People did. The guards who stood on the walls were the only ones who could make them strong. Being a castle guard meant accepting a strange balance in life. Long periods of a boring routine that was broken up by moments of pure fear. You were pacing the courtyard one day, bored out of your mind, looking at chickens and talking to servants. The next day, the alarm horns were blaring, arrows were flying, and every choice you made had life or death consequences. That kind of emotional whiplash turned guards into smart, practical survivors. It was important to have friends. Guards relied on one another similarly to how sailors depend on their crew members. You learned who could stay calm when, who could handle stress, who had the best eyesight, who made jokes to lighten the mood, and who might freak out in a crisis. I think this bond was one of the few things that made the job bearable. You weren't the only one on the walls. You had brothers next to you. This was true in training. Guards practiced formations, alarm responses, escape routes, and weapons testing all the time. Some castles staged fake invasions to practice surprise attacks. Others worked on drills for talking to each other, horn signals, patterns of light, and loud orders. The goal was clear. When things go wrong, no one should hesitate or get the wrong idea about an order. Back then, when there were no radios, clarity was everything. There was always a sense of fear underneath the discipline, though. Everyone knew that the castle could be attacked at any time before dawn, whether it was during a festival, while the Lord was away, or while they were eating. And not all threats came from soldiers. A castle could be unstable because of fires, disease outbreaks, famines, and political betrayal. From the inside, as well as from the outside, with battering rams. I think that medieval guards were always on edge, but they were able to control it. Always on the lookout, always listening, and always getting ready for the worst. Even though it was dangerous, castle guards made the world a more stable place, which was rare. Their watchfulness kept families safe, protected valuable resources, and kept the fragile sense of order that medieval society needed to stay alive. They weren't knights, they weren't famous heroes, but without them, castles were just pretty stone sculptures that were going to fall over. In the end, castle guards lived on the edge, but they held the line every day and night. That unshakable dedication is what really kept the medieval world going. Even before the sun came up over the rooftops of the Suburra, the poorer parts of Rome were already awake. The wooden shutters slammed open, vendors pulled carts over rough stone streets, and the smell of the smoke from yesterday hung in the morning air. For common people like laborers, porters, washerwomen, scribes, and freedmen, the market wasn't a luxury. You bought your food there because most people didn't have room to store it at home. And to be honest, I think this alone tells you everything you need to know about how Romans lived every day. Every day, you had to negotiate to stay alive. The first people to open were the bread sellers. Customers rushed to the bakery as soon as the first round of loaves came out of the ovens. Some were still tying their tunics, while others held up one bronze coin that decided if they would eat that morning. Beside them, fruit vendors arranged piles of figs, dates, and olives on rough wooden boards. There was no washing, no one polished anything. Rome didn't do presentations. Someone would buy it if it was food. The noise got louder quickly. The boys yelled prices at the top of their lungs. It sounded like an argument when women haggled, and animals would bleed, snarl, or cluck depending on which stall you walked by, and all of it mixed in. These were thieves, small, quick, and brave. I think that Roman markets taught thieves more than any criminal school ever could. You were looking at fresh grapes one minute, and then your purse was gone the next. Water sellers walked between stalls with sloshing buckets because the street fountains weren't always safe. The city was big, pipes leaked, and there was always pollution. It was a risk to get clean water. It may seem strange, but cheap wine was often safer than water. This is why so many Romans walked around a little buzzed before noon. All of the senses were attacked. The sound of metal cups clanging, the bark of vendors, The smell of frying fish or roasting nuts, and the sting of smoke from charcoal braziers. Rome was always loud and busy, but there was a rhythm in the chaos, a strange order that only locals could see. Everyone had their favorite stall, their trusted cellar, and their daily routine. And for plebeians, the market was more than a place to shop. It was where news spread, rumors spread, friendships were formed, and life happened. One loud morning at a time. The market was the beating heart of a city with 1 million people. It started pumping before the sun even thought about rising. The open air stalls were like the lungs of the Roman market, and the tabernae was like the stomach, narrow, smoky, always full, and always loud. These little stores lined the main roads and alleys, and each one was only big enough for a counter. A few clay pots, and a very sweaty owner yelling at customers. I really think that Rome came up with the idea of fast food long before modern towns. Instead of plastic wrappers, they used wooden bowls, and instead of soda, they used cheap watered wine. In a taberna, the food was hot, simple, and filling. Lentil stew, grilled sausages, olives soaked in brine, fried fish, chickpea porridge, leftover cuts of meat simmering in wine sauce, or flatbread with herbs on top. Most common people didn't have kitchens in their homes, and they didn't have ovens, space, or even a real hearth. So, street food wasn't a treat. It was to stay alive. A day without a meal and a tab meant not eating for a whole day. You could smell it first. The smell of fish that should have been sold yesterday, mixed with the smoke from charcoal braziers and garlic oil. I think that the health standards for food in ancient Rome would make modern health inspectors have a heart attack. But Romans had tough stomachs, or at least they acted like they did. There was poison or cheap wine all over the place, served in clay cups from big amphu. It was almost always mixed with something else, flavored with herbs, or both. With honey, people thought that drinking pure, unwatered wine was barbaric and only for Celts or drunks. Still, burning wine was known for being bad because it was often fermented for too long or mixed with things that weren't good for it. But for a few coins, it warmed your chest and helped you forget that you lived in a noisy tenement that could fall down at any moment. Honestly, who could blame them? Tabernae was also a place where people could meet. Workers talked about pay. People who bet on dice games fought with each other, and street philosophers yelled at anyone who would listen, who didn't ask. It was dirty, crowded, and not very clean, but that's where life happened. There were deals, there were fights. People became friends over hot bowls of stew, and thieves are always thieves lurking in the background. It was easy to catch someone who was eating while distracted, and it was easy to get away in a crowded place. The taberna was more than just a place to eat. It was where you could feel, taste, and smell the city's pulse. Rome may have ruled an empire, but it survived one bowl of street stew at a time. Don't look at the buildings if you want to know what life was like on the streets of Rome. Look at the people selling things. They were the real music of the city. They would yell prices, praise their goods, insult their competitors, and do everything else short of fighting to get customers' attention. I really think that Roman vendors would make modern salespeople look bad. They didn't have any microphones, ads, or neon signs. They just had lungs strong enough to scare birds out of trees. Every seller had a plan. Fish. Even when the smell said otherwise, sellers bragged about how fresh their goods were. Fruit sellers stacked their figs in perfect pyramids because how they looked was very important. Olive sellers would let customers try one or two, then make them feel bad for not buying a whole bowl. Bakers held up warm loaves like treasure, letting the steam rise up into the air. And spice traders were the market's con artists. They would brag that their imported pepper came from India when it probably came from a warehouse down the street. Prices were never set. People were expected to haggle. A seller would start with a price that was way too high. The customer would insultingly low, and the whole negotiation turned into a show. People who walked by watched for fun. Kids made bets. In Rome, buying food wasn't a deal, it was fun. Of course, vendors weren't just noisy, they were very protective of their land. If a new person set up too close, it could lead to a shouting match or even a full blown brawl with bread rolls flying through the air. I would really pay to see a fight in a Roman bakery. A lot of the vendors were former slaves who were buying their freedom or immigrants from the provinces who were trying to make a living in the empire's busiest city. Their stalls showed where they came from. Greeks selling honey cakes, Syrians selling sesame treats, and Egyptians making spiced beans. Rome was a mess, but it was also surprisingly diverse. You could taste half of the Mediterranean world on one street, but underneath the colors and noise was a sense of hopelessness. Vendors had to sell enough every day to stay alive the next day. There were no safety nets or guaranteed pay. Being sick meant not making any money. Bad weather made kids hungry. People worked hard from dawn to dusk in Rome, hoping to sell enough olives, wine, or fish before the day turned bad. But even though it was hard, vendors kept the city fed. Rome's million residents couldn't live without them. Markets weren't just for buying and selling, they were lifelines. And the one vendor yelled "sale" at a time. To keep the city together, your stomach made choices before your brain did if you walked through a Roman market at noon. The smell of frying dough, sizzling meat, and spiced chickpeas was so strong that even the gods on Olympus might have been jealous. People in Rome ate street food because they didn't have kitchens, not because they liked it. And to be honest, I think the Romans made grab and go perfect long before it became a trend in the present. Vendors cooked on portable braziers, which sent smoke into the hot, dusty streets. The most popular meals were easy to make but tasty: grilled sausages and bread, lentil stews, barley porridge, fried fish, dates stuffed with honey, and nuts that have been roasted. Romans weren't choosy. It was good enough if it filled you up and didn't make you sick. Thermopolium food, which was like a fast food counter in ancient times, was one of the most popular things with the crowd. The counters in these stores were made of stone, with jars of hot food inside that were kept warm by coals below. You'd walk up, Point at something that was bubbling, and a ladle full of it would end up in your bowl. I think they deserve a lot more credit than they get. They were the first of their kind, a mix of a modern food stall, diner, and street cart. And then there was some wine, cheap, sour, often watered down, and flavored with herbs. A cup didn't cost much, which is probably why half the city spent their afternoons a little drunk. But considering how stressful Roman street life was, I can't blame them for how hard life was. Of course, there was always danger with every good thing. There were no rules about food. Vendors used the oil again and again until it turned black. Fish stayed in the sun longer than anyone would want to. Sometimes the meat skewers had more bone than meat. I believe that to eat Roman food, you needed a stomach that was made of fire. The very unlucky got sick. The people who really knew what they were doing just shrugged and kept eating. The taste of Roman street food wasn't what made it so great. It was the way it felt. People pushed and shoved. Cooks yelled orders. Kids begged for scraps. Musicians played for money. And the smell of spices, like coriander and cumin, wafted through the noise. Food brought everyone together, people who were slaves, free men, citizens, foreigners, beggars, soldiers, and merchants. Street food was a reliable, comforting, and communal thing in a world where life was often hard and unpredictable. One sizzling skewer at a time, it added flavor to the daily struggle and kept the city alive. If the Roman Forum was the street markets were the empire's beating, chaotic heart, while the political brain was its brain. Walking through one meant giving up all of your senses. All at once, sight, sound, and smell were too much. Honestly, I think a time traveler would only last about 5 minutes before they begged for earplugs and fresh air. First came the noise, vendors yelling out at prices, bakers yelling that their bread was still hot. Fishmongers yelled at each other to convince customers that their catch was fresh from Austria, even though everyone knew that half of the fish had spent the night in a bucket of water that wasn't very clean. With kids laughing or crying, donkeys braying, dogs barking, and the occasional drunk talking about politics, you had a soundscape that made modern city traffic seem calm. Then the people came. People didn't walk in straight lines. They moved like water in unpredictable waves. One moment you were stuck between two women who were balancing baskets on their heads. The next thing that happened was that a legionary cut straight through the middle of the street like he owned the place, which is what Romans kind of thought soldiers did. I think that navigating Roman markets should be an Olympic sport. Avoiding loose chickens, stepping over spilled olives, and dodging carts. You had to be quick on your feet. The smells stacked up like a complicated perfume that went very wrong. Fresh fruit mixed with rotten fruit, hot stew mixed with animal waste, and sweat mixed with incense sold by traveling Syrians. Rome, it smelled like a mix of life, death, food, work, and ambition that I will never forget. I find it strange, but I admire it. Romans didn't try to be sterile. They liked the mess because it was real. And in the middle of the chaos, there were times of pure theater. A fight over the price of figs could turn into a yelling match on the street. Today could be the day that a random musician decides to show off a new instrument. A storyteller drew a crowd with stories of heroes, but a cart full of people drove by and drowned him out. Amphory. Something new happened every second, but under all the noise and chaos, the market had a rhythm that was almost like that of a living thing. People needed this chaos to stay alive. It gave them food, jobs, and entertainment, and it brought them together. Yes, Roman markets were dirty, loud, and tiring, but they were also full of life, social, and full of human energy, and I think they were the closest thing to a city's soul that the ancient world had. Alive, raw, and unfiltered, if the Roman. If the street market were a living thing, the thieves would be the parasites that lived on it, persistent, smart, and impossible to get rid of. Petty crime wasn't something that happened because of market life. It was part of it. There were thousands of people packed together, and pickpockets loved the place because people had coin purses hanging from their belts. I really think that Roman thieves should have gotten a degree in criminal innovation because some of their methods were very impressive in a bad way. Kids were the most common thieves. They were quick, small, and not taken seriously, so they moved through crowds like fish in water. A bump on the elbow, a pull on the sleeve, and a fake trip made your purse go halfway across the street. Older thieves worked together in groups. One person talked to you to keep you busy, another person blocked your view, and a third person took the goods. It was organized chaos, and I think modern scammers would like how well it worked. Of course, there were guards at the market. They walked around with clubs and gave everyone who looked at them a suspicious look. Looked too awake or too calm. But guards couldn't be everywhere at once. Rome was huge, and criminals moved faster than the law could catch them. Some of the victims yelled for help, thief of fur, but the person who did it was long gone by the time the crowd reacted, disappeared into a maze of stairs and alleys. The sellers weren't innocent either. Some people cheated by using rigged scales, hollowed out weights, or dampened grain that cost more per pound. To make old fish shine, a fishmonger might sprinkle them with water. A person who sells fruit might put a layer of fresh figs over the top of rotten ones. I think this is funny in a dark way. Everyone was doing what they had to do to stay alive, even if it meant breaking some rules. But thieves didn't just take things, they also took chances. A family that is hungry could lose their dinner money in a flash. A worker could lose his week's pay before he even got home. Crime wasn't just a bother, it was terrible, but there was a strange acceptance of it. Romans knew that a city with a lot of people in it made people compete for food, work, luck, comfort, and safety, among other things. Some people fought back. Store owners hired guards. People who were shopping hid coins under their tunics or in their sandals. Parents told their kids to stay close, but the market was too big, too busy, and too unpredictable to be safe. And maybe that's why it was so hard to resist. Every step in the Roman street market was a risk. You might leave with a basket full of food or half the money you came in with. Risk and in every crowded street, need and want danced together. If you ever want to go back in time to ancient Rome, let me give you a gentle wake up call. The city didn't smell like clean linen and marble temples. It smelled like a lot of people, thick, strong, and overwhelming. And the street markets were the best place to see it. I think that people today romanticize Rome way too much. If you put them in a real Roman market for 5 minutes, half of them would pass out and the other half would run back. To the time machine, let's begin with the streets. There were hundreds of thousands of people living in Rome, but there were no garbage trucks, no sewer grates, and no citywide cleaning schedule. Trash built up in the corners. Food scraps rotted on the stone, and stray animals came by and left their own gifts. Add in fish guts, spilled wine, and pee. Yes, it was completely normal for people to pee in public, and the smoke from 1,000 charcoal braziers made the air smell like a mix of good and bad things. The noise wasn't any, more gentle. People yelled all the time, not because they were mad, but because you couldn't hear them any other way. Vendors yelled prices, kids screamed while playing tag, carts rattled over stones, dogs barked, and every now and then a rooster crowed loudly for no reason at all. And because Rome had no rules about noise, the market was full of noise from dawn to dusk. I really think that just living in Rome made their lungs stronger and their patience thicker. And then there was the dirt on the ground, where water runoff mixed with organic waste, sludge formed. The sandals slipped, the tunics got dirty. You had to be careful where you walked, and even then, you'd probably step in something that wasn't right. Sometimes public slaves would sweep, but only if someone complained loudly enough. Rome had to deal with its problems with the sun, time, and a lot of hope. But here's the weird part: people still loved the markets. The smells and sounds were a normal part of Roman life. They meant that the city was alive, not dead. Dying. They meant that trade was going on, fires were going on, pots were cooking, and animals were living. Romans thought that being uncomfortable was just part of being civilized. It sounds like a mess from a modern point of view, maybe even too much to handle. But to the Romans, this was the heart of the empire: dirty, noisy, crowded, and full of chances. The market's dirtiness was a reminder of Rome's biggest paradox in its own messy way. The streets that smelled built the strongest empire in the world, like the fish stew and donkey dung from yesterday. The Roman street market was more than just a place to buy figs or haggle over olives, even though it was dirty, loud, and chaotic. It was the empire's unofficial social media site. Plebeians didn't read the news to find out who got elected, who got kicked out, who got divorced, who died, or who made a fool of themselves at last night's dinner party. They went shopping, and to be honest, I think the market worked better than half of the political. Rome made a lot of important institutions. Every morning, gossip spread faster than wine at a party. Women stood around fruit stalls and talked about what they heard about their neighbors. Men waiting for bread told each other about Senate debates, which were usually so exaggerated that they were hard to believe. Retired soldiers bragged loudly about fights they had never been in. Slave traders and merchants heard everything and said it twice as loudly. Rome didn't just tell people about news, it acted it out. No matter what you thought, politics came up in conversations. Supporters of different candidates fought over things like the price of grain, taxes, military campaigns, and which politician was secretly sleeping with whose wife. These arguments could get very heated, and sometimes they did. People thought that fistfights in the middle of the market were fun to watch. I think the Romans accidentally came up with political commentary. Half of what they say sounds just like what people say in modern online comments. But the market wasn't just about drama, it was also a place where people met. Fishermen often sold their catch to the same tavern owners. Olive farmers knew who their loyal customers were. Freedmen looked for work. Mothers set up marriages or made deals with other families. The market brought the community together in a way that temples and government buildings never could. A lot of performers came here too. Jugglers, flute players, snake handlers, storytellers, and even amateur philosophers used the crowds to make some money or get some attention. Kids followed them around, half in awe and half scared. People spread the word quickly if someone told a funny joke or played a smart song. People in Rome didn't get famous through social media. It came from being loud, creative, and being in the right place at the right time in the market. There were also the fortune tellers. They read signs from birds or threw pebbles and patterns to tell fortunes for anyone who would pay a few coins. In my opinion, they were very good at making things up on the spot. They always had an answer that sounded mystical, no matter what you asked. The market wasn't in the end. Where Romans got their food, it was where they interacted with other people. It was a place where people acted out, a political battleground, a rumor mill, and a community center that looked like chaos. It wasn't optional for most Romans. It was necessary. The Roman street market was more than just noise, dirt, food, gossip, and thieves. It was a war zone for survival. Anyone who walked into that crowded maze had to face a simple truth. If you didn't fight for your spot you didn't eat if you didn't work. And to be honest, I think this daily fight for survival shaped Roman identity much more than their big marble buildings ever did. Plebeians lived on very small margins. Most people earned their pay every day, not every week, so every morning was a surprise. A bad day at work meant a small dinner. If you missed a day, you didn't get dinner. The market was where this economic truth became painfully clear. You only bought what you could afford, which was usually enough for one meal. Food. Never took it for granted. It was deserved. People learned how to make the most of their money. In the afternoon, older vegetables were cheaper. Fishmongers lowered prices before closing to avoid throwing food out. Bakers offered yesterday's bread for a discount. Watching Romans navigate these choices feels incredibly familiar, like seeing ancient roots of modern paycheck to page living. Personally, I find it strangely comforting to see how ancient people dealt with the same struggles we do, making budgets, searching for bargains, and hoping today's money lasts until tomorrow. The market also reflected social inequality with painful honesty. Wealthy Romans rarely set foot here. Instead, they sent slaves. The poor, on the other hand, had to fight their way through the crowds, fiercely bargaining for every coin. A patrician might never have smelled rotten fruit on the ground, but a plebeian did. They lived close to the ground, both in a physical and a figurative sense. But even though things were hard, the market was strong. You saw it in the baker who laughed through exhaustion, the widow who haggled fearlessly, the fisherman who arrived before dawn hoping for a decent sale. You saw it in the kids who ran barefoot between stalls, turning poverty into play. Rome liked to brag about its military victories, but in my opinion, its real triumph was the endurance of ordinary people who carved out a life in a city that rarely made things easy. As the day wound down, stalls closed, leftovers were swept into gutters, and the smell of charcoal faded. From the air, the market grew quiet, but only until dawn. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The shouting, the bargaining, the cooking, the stealing, the surviving. Rome didn't run on emperors or senators. It ran on these everyday struggles. And in the chaotic heartbeat of the street market, you can still hear the spirit of the empire's millions. Stubborn, hungry, resilient,